let's get started. It's my pleasure to introduce Alissa Kotowski, which will be giving our DLS today. Today we cannot have Alissa here today. She's in the Netherlands, but I'm sure that he'll give a really nice talk about deformation of amphiboles. Alissa is an assistant professor of structural geology and electron microscopy in the Department of Earth Sciences at Utrecht University. She's originally from Boston, Massachusetts, and earned her bachelor from Boston College in 2014. She then went to do her PhD at the University of Texas at Austin, getting her PhD in 2019 as a NSF Graduate Research Fellow, working on exome subduction zones, reconstructing structural and rheological evolution, and interrogating the rock record to constrain mechanisms of the leaf transit in subduction zones. And during her time in Austin, it's when Alissa and I met, working with rocks from the subducted slab below the Oman ophiolite. After her PhD, he moved to Montreal to work as a postdoctoral research fellow at McGill, where she has started to incorporate experimental approach to her research using nanoindentation to probe material plasticity with a particular focus on amphiboles. She is now an assistant professor at Utrecht, where she is leading an active and lively research group that primarily focuses on flow behavior of solid earth materials, including ice and silicate rocks, but with an emphasis on the initiation and maintenance of subduction plate boundaries, both on the modern Earth and in the deep Earth history. And with that, I'll leave it to Alissa. Excited to hear your talk, and all yours.
Great. Thanks, Juan Carlos, for that introduction, and thanks everyone for tuning in today. I'm really excited to be here virtually and share with you what I've been thinking about in terms of amphibole rheology for the past few years. So what I'll do is show you a combined approach using naturally deformed amphibole-rich rocks from exhumed paleo-subduction plate interfaces, and I'll also use an experimental approach, nanoindentation, to show you what we can learn from an experimental technique using this to learn about material plasticity. So we're really interested in subduction zones because subduction zones represent these lithosphere scale zones of weakness that are able to localize strain and maintain this weakness for millions of years. And inside subduction zones, along these plate interface boundaries, amphibole is one of the most common volumetrically abundant phases. So in order to understand the mechanics of these really fundamental plate boundaries, we need to zoom into the grain scale and think about what every single grain is doing, including, for example, amphiboles. So another thing that I really like about subduction zones is, despite the fact that they represent these zones of weakness, they still make mechanical accidents. So we still see things like earthquakes and slow slip events that occur in subduction zones. And so the question that I want to ask today is, if my slide will advance, let's see. Yes. So why do these weak subduction shear zones host slip transients, and how might amphibole contribute to this? So I definitely don't promise all of the answers to this question today. And in fact, I hope to leave you with more questions than answers. But what I do hope to convince you of is that amphibole rheology is a function of temperature, distribution of phases, and fluid content, and it can accommodate both steady state and potentially transient deformation under a wide range of relevant geologic conditions. So we're interested in the zone along the subduction plate interface that produces these slip transients, where every now and then you get rapid accelerations of strain rates, and this interrupts steady state flow. So in the last several decades, geodetic and seismic observations have become increasingly sensitive and increasingly good at pinpointing the locations where these slip transients occur along the plate interface. And we call this zone the transitional zone, and this is down dip of the nominally seismogenic zone, where the megathrust will actually produce large and catastrophic earthquakes. And it's up dip of this deeper aseismically creeping zone where rocks are too high temperature to actually release seismic energy, and they're just ductily flowing and accommodating plate motion. And inside this transitional zone, we think there's some combination of frictional and viscous deformation, so both brittle and ductile, and we can get things like episodic tremor and slow slip events to occur, or ETS. So thinking about ETS events, they're made up of both seismic and aseismic deformation. The seismic component is bursts of microseismicity, low-frequency earthquakes, and tremor. And this occurs spatially and temporally coincident with slow slip events, which are basically conditions where you see accelerated slip rates along the interface relative to background plate rates, but it's not quite fast enough to radiate seismic energy. But these ETS events are very important because together, these bursts of microseismicity and slow slip events can release the same amount of energy as a magnitude 6 or 7 earthquake. So they're actually very important in terms of estimating the long-term and average slip budget of a subduction plate interface. Another thing that's really cool about tremor and low frequency earthquakes is that it actually can dynamically trigger itself. So that's shown quite nicely in this 3D block diagram for an ETS event that occurred in Cascadia in 2010. You can see that it started somewhere beneath Seattle in these blue dots, and then over a 1-month period of time, it migrated systematically towards the north and the south along the interface, making this kind of tremor avalanche or cascade effect. So we need to understand what's happening to the rocks in this transitional zone to think about what mechanics could actually be driving these low frequency earthquakes, slow slip events, and this really nice avalanche. One way that we can tackle that is by looking at metamorphic rocks that were exhumed from this transitional zone back to Earth's surface. So if we look at geologic exposures of these types of rocks, we see quite a lot of similarities between them, namely that there's a lot of rheological heterogeneity down there. So in this really nice example from some of the rocks that I worked on for my PhD from the island of Syros in the Cyclades of Greece, we can see that if you take a piece of oceanic crust to blue schist or eclogite facies conditions, you actually make a lot of different metamorphic rock types all at the same time. So in this case, we have blue schists and eclogites. And because you have different materials, they have different inherent strengths, different rheological behaviors. This leads to a competency contrast whereby the weaker blue schists ductily flow and the relatively stronger, more competent eclogites can transiently break brittly. So this is a good explanation potentially for this coupled brittle ductile deformation, potentially explaining these slip transients. And if we zoom in and really think about what these asperities are doing, it makes conceptual sense to understand how they could be potentially creating these low frequency earthquakes. So you can imagine these things are asperities, looking at this really simplified ductile matrix model from Chesler and Krieger from 2017. Essentially, this is a heterogeneous patch of interface with these black circles here, which could potentially produce these low frequency earthquake slip, but it's surrounded by this more ductile white material. In this case, it's aseismically slipping, creeping interface. So these asperities can actually act as stress concentrators. And because they concentrate stress, that's why they can periodically release energy by low frequency earthquakes. But the problem is that these little asperities cannot explain all of the energy that we know is released during an ETS event. They can barely explain half of it at best. So this very simplified ductile matrix model, where this surrounding ductile matrix is not contributing to these LFEs, this is probably actually not realistic. We need to think about what this matrix material surrounding these asperities is actually doing, because the rheology of this matrix is fundamentally going to control how much stress these little clasts can actually support. And it's also going to control whether these little asperities can actually link up and communicate to potentially create that avalanche or that cascade effect. What's happening in every single grain in this matrix rheology is probably also contributing to slow slip. So that accelerated strain rate, higher than background strain rates, but not quite fast enough to radiate seismic energy. And something that's really interesting is even when we don't have these block and matrix structures present in the exhumed rock record, we still have a ton of heterogeneity at a lot of different length scales. We see things like shear bands and folds and buckles. There are phase and lithological boundaries in these rocks, and there are, even at the grain scale, different strengths belonging inherently to different types of minerals. So even if we don't have this block and matrix, brittle, ductile, obvious deformation structure, there's still a lot of opportunity in these rocks to create stress concentrations, to create strain rate fluctuations. And we really need to zoom into every single grain here to understand what those could potentially look like. So what I present to do is kind of shift the question and ask for any sort of exhumed rock that we can see. If you apply a constant loading rate, how does each individual mineral actually respond to that stress or to that loading rate? And how does this change as a function of temperature or finite strain or length scale? And how can all of this actually naturally give rise to slip transients? So in order to start answering this question, we need to have an idea of what's going on down there and what can we actually say in terms of characterizing the conditions of the slow slip and tremor producing environment. So from this figure on the left, this is a pressure temperature diagram. And what this is doing is showing you the pressure and temperature conditions where active subduction zones, transform faults, and accretionary prisms are actually producing slip transients today. So these are conditions estimated from active margins where we know these slip transients are occurring. And the takeaway from this diagram is that we see these things occurring over an incredible range of pressure temperature space. So this actually complicates things quite a lot, because what this means is that slip transients cannot be limited to a specific metamorphic assemblage, a dehydration reaction, a state of pore fluid pressure, or even these block and matrix type structures, because all of these bullet points are all much too prescriptive to be able to find a mechanism that explains the wide range of conditions where we see these things occurring. So what are the common denominators, if anything? Well, if we think just about subduction zones, then actually most of the inputs that are going into these things are quite similar across the board. Basically, we have subducting and metamorphosing oceanic crust. And if we bring oceanic crust to different pressure and temperature conditions, then we may expect to see different metamorphic mineral assemblages, but all of them have amphibole as a key strain accommodating phase. So now in this diagram on the left, this is again a pressure temperature diagram. Now this is showing you the metamorphic phase stability of different minerals that will form under certain regions of pressure temperature space if you subduct an average mid-ocean ridge basalt composition. So if you do this along this black, gray, or white curve here, representing a hot subduction zone, warm subduction zone, or a cold subduction zone, then what you can see is you'll predict rocks to be amphibolite facies, epidote amphibolite facies, or blue schist facies. So all of these different types of rocks have very different mineral assemblages, which of course reflect the pressures and temperatures that they experience, but all of them have amphibole in a very important volumetric abundance. So the composition of these amphiboles will differ depending on these PT conditions, but it's there nonetheless. And they're all occurring under this slow slip and tremor depth range. But with this common denominator comes a common problem, and that is that we have very poor and very few quantitative constraints on sodic and calcic amphibole rheology. So the sodic amphiboles being more common in the cold regime, the calcic amphiboles being more common in the warm regime. But what this means is that we're lacking currently a quantitative understanding or predictive capability to think about what these rocks are doing at the grain scale under these deformation conditions, and could any of them actually potentially produce a slip transient. So what I propose to do today is bring you to 3 places where I have studied exhumed metamorphic rocks in the rock record that record subduction under hot, warm, and cold paleogeotherms. And so what I'll do is I'll bring you to Quebec to look at some garnet amphibolites. Then I'll bring you to Oman to look at some epidote amphibolites. And then I'll bring you to Greece to look at some blue schists. So notably, this is going to be a transect through amphibole composition space. So we'll go from hornblende to edenite to glaucophane. And it's also a transect through hydration state space. So we're going from hot and dry with these red colors over here to relatively cold and wet to these blue colors over here. So the goal here is to compare and contrast the natural microstructures that form in these amphibole-rich rocks under a variety of different paleogeotherms, and think about, at the grain scale, what mechanisms are occurring and how could these either suppress or give rise to slip transients. So that will take up the majority of the presentation. And then towards the end, what I'll do is show you some nanoindentation experiments on glaucophane. And we've used these mechanical tests to contextualize some of the natural microstructures that we see in these rocks. Okay, so the first place that I want to bring you is to the Mont Albert ophiolite up in the Gaspé Peninsula of Quebec. So Mont Albert is an incomplete Ordovician ophiolite, and it's related to a series of Quebec ophiolites that the most famous example of which being the Bay of Islands complex in Newfoundland. We call this an incomplete ophiolite because unfortunately the crustal section of the ophiolite is missing here. But as you can see from this really gorgeous panoramic photo, we have a whole bunch of these orange, brown weathered colored rocks. And all of this is weathered mantle. So we have the base of the ophiolite mantle here, and it transitions over here on the right side of the photo to this black gray colored rock on this northeast arête. What this is the transition to a slice of subducted, underthrust, metamorphosed oceanic crust. So this stuff here is structurally underneath the mantle in this orange-brown color. And what this is in the context of ophiolite tectonics is something that we call the metamorphic soul. So this is actually thought to be the record, the structural and metamorphic record of subduction initiation. So this is a relatively high temperature, high strain shear zone of rocks that forms at the first stage of underthrusting of a piece of oceanic crust underneath a hanging wall mantle sequence. So the next photo that I'm going to show you is going to be taken from this little inverted white triangle looking down at the northeast arête. So at first glance, what we can see in these rocks is a really stark contrast in color reflecting that paleoplate boundary. So we have these orange-brown colored rocks here. This is the mantle, and then they transition abruptly into these black-gray colored rocks. That's the underthrust metamorphic soul. If we overlay a little annotation here, this gives you a sense of what this structure looks like. And if we zoom into the metamorphic soul rocks, this is what they look like close to that paleoplate contact. So these are black-colored garnet-bearing amphibolites. All of the black foliation here is Amphibole-Rich, but we have these nice red porphyroblasts of garnet as well. Sometimes we have these white bands here. This is plagioclase feldspar, and then also some pistachio green colors here. There's a little bit of epidote as well. So these rocks are thought to be retrogressed granulites, meaning that they started their lives and got to peak conditions in the granulite facies. Those rocks would have been basically purely pyroxene and garnet bearing. Those are two very strong, very dry mineralogies. But now we see a lot of hornblende coming in after pyroxene, and this is thought to be a sort of hydration reaction of those granulites. But where we do see the relict granulite lenses, there's not that much strength contrast between the amphibolites and the granulites. So since we know that granulites tend to be relatively strong, rheologically speaking, rocks, the fact that we only see a little bit of pinching, a little bit of boudinage of the granulites within the amphibolites starts to tell us that the amphibolites are also relatively strong, rheologically speaking, rocks. This is also confirmed by this really nice example. Sometimes we see these garnetite layers. So this is all garnet here in this red color. And it's also just barely being pinched and boudinaged within this Amphibole-Rich matrix. So we're getting a sense from looking at other minerals that we have good quantitative and qualitative indicators for in terms of their rheology, that these amphibolites are actually behaving quite strong. So now we can look at some microstructures and start thinking about what's happening at the grain scale. So these garnet amphibolites are very heterogeneous. We have some of these relict layers of pyroxene-rich material here in this lighter green diopside. And you can see that there's not really any clear strain localization into one layer or the other. So the amphibole and the pyroxene actually seem to have relatively similar strains. Looking at the mineralogy, we have plagioclase here with high anorthite components. We have happy almandine-rich garnets here. And the composition of the amphibole is Schirmachite to hornblende. The amount of titanium that can go into an amphibole is very sensitive to temperature. So if you measure the amount of titanium in the amphibole, you can actually use that to calculate a metamorphic temperature. So these minerals have about 0.1 to 0.2 titanium atoms per formula unit, which is relatively high. So this is telling us that these garnet amphibolites are forming and metamorphosing and deforming at about 800 degrees Celsius. So now what I want to do is zoom in to the amphibole-rich layers here and start to think about what is the grain scale mechanism that is accommodating deformation in these rocks. And in order to do that, I'll use a technique in electron microscopy, which we call electron backscatter diffraction, or EBSD. So with EBSD, what we're able to do is map out the types of minerals that are in the rock, their spatial distributions. We can measure things like grain size. We can look at grain boundary and phase boundary morphology. We can quantify crystallographic preferred orientation, and we can look inside minerals as well and look at patterns of intracrystalline plastic strain. So with all of these observations, we're able to make an interpretation regarding deformation mechanism, and this is fundamental to understanding this rock's rheology. So with this EBSD phase map on the top, this is just color-coded by type of mineral. All of the green here is this hornblende amphibole. And you can see that it's actually creating the majority of the framework of this microstructure. So we can use this observation to say that the hornblende is controlling the strength of the rock at this scale. We also see that there is a bimodal grain size distribution. So we see big yellow grains of hornblende surrounded by small blue grains, and these small grains tend to be equant and polygonal in shape. The boundaries between the big grains tend to be amoeboid and locally serrated. We can also look inside of the grains and look at the patterns of intracrystalline plasticity in them. So what I'm showing you now is a misorientation map. Basically, what this shows you is for every single pixel that is measured with the electron microscope, it plots the degree of misorientation of that pixel relative to the average orientation of the grain. So that's a bit of a mouthful, but all that matters is that this is basically a map showing you undulose extinction or subgrain formation. So if you've ever looked down a petrographic microscope and cross-polarized light and rotated the stage and seen sweeping undulose extinction or nice subgrains in something like quartz, this is basically exactly what that's showing you. What we can see from this misorientation map is that the patterns of intracrystalline plasticity are extremely systematic. So we see some dislocation walls or subgrain walls that are aligning parallel to the foliation, some perpendicular to the foliation. A lot of these big grains have both, and a lot of these big grains have increased amount of misorientation near their margins. So the fact that we see these really systematic orientations of subgrain walls tells us that there are dislocations moving through these grains, and they're doing that in a very systematic way. They're moving along specific slip systems on certain planes in certain directions. And this is also consistent with this figure on the bottom, which is a pole figure. So what this is showing you is the poles to certain crystallographic planes and directions, And the only important thing to think about from this is that the fact that we see clustering of the poles to certain planes and directions means that there is a systematic preferred orientation of the hornblende in this rock. So we have certain specific alignments of the 100 poles perpendicular to the foliation, and for example, 001 directions aligned parallel and contained within the lineation or defining the lineation. So all of these observations are consistent with the interpretation that hornblende in this rock is deforming by dynamic recrystallization accommodated by dislocation creep. So why does that matter? Why is that important in this scenario? This is important, I think, because maybe during dislocation creep in hornblende under high temperature conditions at about 800 degrees Celsius, the fact that we actually are seeing this rock properly creeping means that we have a balance between the number of dislocations coming in and the number of dislocations going out. That's fundamental to the concept of creep in this case. What this means is that you have dislocation glide and dislocation climb and recovery to accommodate that dislocation in equals dislocation out requirement. So I think what this potentially means is that under high temperature conditions, diffusion is fast enough and efficient enough to facilitate recovery of dislocations. This allows the rock to deform to high strains, and maybe this means this rock does not need to make any slip transients to keep up. It doesn't need to make that mechanical mistake, that slip transient, to deform to high strains. Okay, now I will take you to stop number 2, which is the Oman ophiolite, and we will look at some epidote amphibolites here. So these rocks occupy a similar structural position as the rocks that I just showed you at Mont Albert in Canada, but now the interface shear zone here is a bit cooler. So this is a warm subduction zone as opposed to a hot subduction zone. But we're in the same type of tectonic environment now. This is still an ophiolite. So we're still recording subduction initiation in this metamorphic soil configuration. So in this nice panoramic photo, you can see these brown colors again, that will be familiar now, and then these darker gray, green, black rocks in the background. And annotating this as well, we can see that we have at the base of this ophiolite sequence a series of interlayered carbonated peridotites or lisbonites and hydrated peridotites or serpentinites. And these are in fault contact across this Semile fault with these green-blue rocks in the background. This is the metamorphic soil. This is the warm subduction shear zone. So the rocks that I'm going to show you here were sampled from Oman drilling project drill site BT1B. Here, there were 300 meters of continuous rock drilled and recovered, and we had 200 meters of basal mantle lisbonite, so carbonated peridotite, the fault contact, and then 100 continuous meters of sub-ophiolite metamorphic rocks. And we recovered this with 100% recovery, which is great. So let's take a look at the core and then step down in scale of observation. So at BT1B, we have the base of the carbonated mantle here, these nice red lisbonite rocks, and they're separated from the underlying sub-ophiolite metamorphics from this really nice brittle fault contact. In the metamorphic soil, we have 30 meters of metasedimentary material at the top, underlain by 70 meters of metamafic material. In both of these different units, we see an extremely strong foliation and schistosity. There's a foliation that's isoclinally folded in places. We see really nice fine compositional banding in the metamafic rocks. There's a ton of really fine-grained wet minerals here, things like amphibole, epidote, chlorite, things like that. And we also see a series of veins that are cross-cutting the foliation here and variably transposed into the foliation. So we can actually use the presence of these veins, zooming into the microscale, and use things like quartz and calcite to say something about the relative strength of these rocks. So the epidote amphibolite matrix here, we can see that it's exhibiting a similar macroscopic strength to this calcite vein, but it's weaker than this quartz, which is being boudinaged within this foliation. So this allows us to put a bit of a bracket on how strong or weak these epidote amphibolites really are. And in fact, the fact that they're showing very similar macroscopic strength as the calcite, or in this case, microscopic strength as the calcite, then that tells us that these things are actually extremely weak, because we know calcite to be quite a weak mineral, especially in a relatively wet environment like we have here. So in this case now, amphibole is not a load-bearing mineral. And we can see this if we look even closer with a backscattered electron image as well. So you can see these amphibole porphyroblasts here with cores of actinolite and rims of edenite and pargasite. And these rims are growing parallel to the lineation within the foliation here along the amphibole 001 direction. They're also surrounded by lots of albite, some chlorite and muscovite epidote. And if you speak amphibole, this zoning with actinolite cores to edenite rims actually means that these minerals are growing as this foliation is deforming, as pressures and temperatures are increasing. So this zoning is telling us that this fabric is prograde, forming during subduction to peak conditions. If we do the same thing with the titanium content in these minerals, we now have much, much less titanium, so 0.05 atoms per formula unit. So this puts the formation of this prograde subduction fabric at a maximum temperature conditions of 500 degrees Celsius. So these prograde fabrics demonstrate that many phases are here and acting to accommodate strain together. So for example, we have amphibole, epidote, and albite. So now we can take a closer look at this with EBSD as well to think about the deformation mechanisms. So these microstructures are very complicated, but also really fascinating. In this phase map here, we have coarse-grained pargasite in green with a moderate strength crystallographic preferred orientation. And we have epidote, very fine-grained in this blue color with little to no crystallographic preferred orientation. If we think about intercrystalline plastic strain, then we see dislocation accommodated deformation in amphibole crystals. So this manifests as these systematic undulose extinction sweeping through and these tilt walls, these dislocation walls that are forming as these dislocations are gliding through this crystal. So we don't see anything like this if you make the same kinds of maps for epidote. What I think this means is that at the scale of this microstructure, we're seeing evidence for coupled dislocation and diffusion accommodated deformation. So this is important because dislocation and diffusion accommodated deformation have very different grain size sensitivities and stress sensitivities to flow. So the fact that we have both of them operating together in concert probably gives us plenty opportunity to create internal stress heterogeneities and internal stress changes that might eventually lead to something that resembles a slip transient. But let's zoom in even more and think about how this might work at the scale of the at the amphibole here. So we have actually also two deformation mechanisms operating just in the amphibole, even if we ignore the epidote. And that's because we already had evidence for diffusion accommodated deformation in the form of the core to rim zonations, that metamorphic growth. But we also have evidence for this dislocation glide here in the form of these subgrains and tilt walls. So if we look at the orientation of these subgrain walls, this looks like easy glide along the A plane in the C direction. So on this little block diagram on the right, that's basically shown by this middle block here, where you have dislocations gliding in this 100 plane at the top of this block towards the 001, the shortest Berger's vector, the easiest slip direction for a dislocation to move. And so what we actually can see is that we see these dislocations gliding through and then creating these subgrain walls. This is where the dislocations are essentially piling up and getting stuck. But then if these dislocations are getting stuck here, What happens then after that? Well, under low temperature conditions, diffusion is relatively slow. So recovery is probably limited. And the dislocations can glide along the 0, 0, 1, the shortest Burgers vector, and diffusion also happens along this same direction. We know this because of the direction of the growth zoning in the metamorphism. But this diffusion doesn't actually help the dislocations because they need to climb in another direction, away from 0, 0, 1, or they need to cross-slip or annihilate in order to achieve recovery. But diffusion or cross-slip in other directions seems to be very, very hard. So what this means ultimately is that we will have an imbalance in the number of dislocations coming in versus the number of dislocations going out. If it's hard for dislocations to leave, then they will come in, they will glide, they will hit each other and tangle, and you will actually create more internal stress and strain gradients as a function of the inability for dislocations to leave. So I think what this actually is showing us during this low temperature plasticity glide dominated mechanism is that we actually are producing internal stress and strain gradients as these dislocations are climbing through, or gliding through rather. So as a response to the generation of internal stress and strain gradients during this low temperature plasticity glide, one of the possible recovery mechanisms that might occur in response to this is something called a dislocation avalanche. This is a well-documented occurrence in the material science literature. And essentially, it might reflect dislocations tangling and then surpassing some critical stress or strain threshold, and then suddenly moving, suddenly recovering, suddenly cross-slipping, or leaving the grain. And so this, by definition, occurs in bursts or as transients. So what I propose is that the operation of this low temperature plasticity mechanism might actually be very important in explaining a potential grain scale mechanism that could produce naturally a slip transient. So now the last place I want to bring you is to Syros Island in the Cyclades of Greece. And these blue schists now record Eocene subduction to eclogite facies conditions. And this now is in a long-lived, well-established subduction zone. In this field photo, you can see one of my favorite forms of rheological heterogeneity. This is a nice, coarse-grained, strong eclogite pod, and it's surrounded by this weaker, fine-grained matrix of blue schist and quartz schist. And in this case, the heterogeneity is here because we subducted and metamorphosed a variety of different types of protoliths. So for example, a coarse-grained gabbro and a fine-grained basalt or mixed phase volcanic rock. So this leads to a competency contrast that leads to coupled brittle and ductile deformation. And we can see this if we zoom in to the margins of these eclogite pods. So here we have brittle shear fractures that are cutting through the eclogite and offsetting it in a domino fashion. And in these shear fractures, we have things that are filled by glaucophane and quartz. So this tells us that these shear fractures are forming under high pressure conditions. Otherwise, there would not be glaucophane, the high pressure, low temperature sodic amphibole in this vein. We also see that this brittle feature is continuous in the external matrix with these ductile shear bands in the blue schists and quartz schists. This is great evidence that we have simultaneous brittle and ductile deformation. So let's take a closer look now into the blue schist matrix to think about what is happening in these matrix rocks. So what is the rheology of this stuff? So we can play a similar game with our EBSD data for our glaucophane-rich rocks. And here we see, similar to the hornblende from Canada, that we have glaucophane now as a load-bearing phase. There are other minerals here, but the microstructure is controlled by the glaucophane, all shown in this green color here. In the bottom, you can see a grain size map. This is comparable again to the hornblende sample, where we have large yellow grains surrounded by small blue grains. But now these small grains tend to be more tabular in shape, whereas the other ones were more equant or polygonal. Our grain boundaries here are also extremely straight, which is different from the hornblende microstructure. If we look at the misorientation map, then we also see very systematic movement of dislocations through these grains. So we're also seeing very specific slip planes and directions that are accommodating this dislocation movement. We see big porphyroblasts here with zones of relatively high misorientation at their margins. And we see small little grains with relatively no internal misorientation. We also see a really, really strong crystallographic preferred orientation, the strongest one that we've seen in the samples that I've shown you. So all of this microstructural evidence is nominally consistent also with deformation and dynamic recrystallization accommodated by dislocation creep. But I propose that this may be a mechanism that is quite distinct from dislocation creep in grain scale processes and actually in the recrystallization mechanism itself. So it is dynamic recrystallization, but potentially by a slightly different mechanism. And the reason for that is twofold. The first reason is that we have one extremely dominant slip system, slip on the A plane in the C direction, and almost no contribution from anything else. This is consistent with glide-dominated low-temperature plasticity in these rocks. And then the second observation is that we have tabular subgrains in tabular hosts. And so I think what this is saying is that the actual recrystallization mechanism making new dynamically crystallized grains might involve some amount of twinning or twisting rather than dislocation climb. And so if this is the case, then this actually looks more like a dynamic recrystallization by plasticity, twinning, and twisting accommodated mechanism rather than conventional or classical dislocation creep. This is also consistent with the fact that these rocks are deforming under lower temperature conditions. So we have more difficult diffusion, more difficult recovery. So if these rocks are to produce dynamic recrystallization, it would probably be by a different mechanism than conventional dislocation creep. So the question then is similar to what we raised for the rocks from Oman. If this is the case, if we have a climb-limited plasticity mechanism dominating this microstructure, how can this amphibole actually proceed to high strain? How can this rock accommodate more strain? And what is going to allow it to do that? And could that mechanism potentially also be consistent with creating a slip transient? So in order to answer this question, the last thing I want to do is to show you some results from nanoindentation experiments that we've done on glaucophane with this question in mind. So nanoindentation, basically all it is small volume hardness testing. This is a technique that's extremely common in the material science community, and it's becoming more and more common as an applied geoscience technique as well. In this photo, what you can see is a Berkovich indentation tip. This is a three-sided pyramid. It's 1 micron tall and 200 nanometers radius of curvature. So this is a tiny little thing. And what you do is you take this, you press it into the surface of your material of interest. In this case, it's being pressed into a metal. The maximum applied load and the residual area from the indent are known and measured respectively. And if you take the ratio, then you can calculate the material hardness. So the tip also generates an in situ confining pressure. This suppresses brittle deformation in favor of mineral plasticity instead of brittle deformation. And the Berkovich tips, though, is a problem for us because the tip is so sharp that basically the sample will yield plastically immediately upon pressing into it. But we are actually interested both in elastic and plastic deformation. So in order to circumvent this, what we do is use a rounded spherical tip instead. This allows us to deform the material elastically first, and then actually measure the plastic response as well. So we can convert the data then to be able to look at things like stress strain curves and and be able to use that to calculate yield hardness, for example, but also to look at post-yield behavior. So this is what the mechanical data look like. We have indentation depth on the x-axis, and applied load on the y-axis. So for each experiment, we select a maximum load and assign a constant loading rate. And during the loading portion of the experiment, you can see these abrupt increases in indentation depth at constant applied load. These are called pop-ins. And physically, these are bursts or avalanches of dislocations, and they glide suddenly after overstressing the crystal. Basically, these are delayed activation of dislocation sources. But conceptually, I want you to think of these as transients. These have sudden displacements on the order of tens to hundreds of nanometers. They arise spontaneously in the rock from loading a crystal at a constant rate, and they occur for basically all grain orientations that we measured. By indenting the same grains of spherical chips with different radii, we can also demonstrate that glaucophane hardness is not only a function of grain orientation, which we expected based on its anisotropy, but also length scale of deformation. So for smaller contact radii or smaller indenter tips, the true yield hardness is higher than that for larger contact radii or indenter tip sizes. The bold circles here show you the best estimates on true yield hardness for these grain orientations, and the smaller circles are pop-ins with relatively small measurable displacements, and the X's are much larger displacements. So what this is a phenomenon that's also very well documented in the materials literature, which is smaller is stronger. And this is thought to reflect the role of strain gradients and dislocations in modifying plastic behavior. So basically, for identical strains of a single crystal, a smaller volume of the crystal will have higher dislocation density, and that makes it harder. So this has huge implications for deformation of texturally heterogeneous rocks, because if we have evidence that a rock is deforming by low temperature plasticity, then what this means is the finer grained portions of the rocks are actually stronger than the coarse grained portions. And implications of the size effect is that for rocks undergoing low temperature plasticity, the grain size variability at the microscale will also imply heterogeneous stress at the grain scale. So the fine grained portions here in the blue colors will actually be stronger than the coarse grained portions. And this could, in theory, lead to stress heterogeneity during continued deformation of this microstructure. So most of us would see this microstructure, and with all the other EBSD data I showed you, we would interpret this as evidence for dislocation creep on its way to a steady state microstructure. But with all the evidence and mechanical data and things that are pointing to low temperature plasticity, I think a different way to view this microstructure is that it might actually have this low temperature plasticity framework. And based on the size effect argument, if this is true, then the grain size here actually has an opposite effect on rock strength than what we typically think of for high temperature creep. So this leads to one last question here, which is, could the microstructural evolution or development and modification of internal stress gradients here during low temperature plasticity actually produce things that look like slip transients? So now I'll just wrap up quickly with what we've learned. So I hope I convinced you that amphibole rheology is a function of temperature, distributions of phases, and water content. And for the highest temperature samples, we have dry, hot dislocation creep that may facilitate steady state flow, while the other colder amphiboles with evidence for low temperature plasticity and diffusion accommodated deformation as well might actually be more favorable to produce stress gradients at the microscale. Based on the macroscopic strength contrast from other rocks and minerals, we can construct a metamafic strength hierarchy. So this I find really interesting because it actually breaks a lot of conventional rules of how we think about material strength. And that's because the hot rocks, the amphibolites, are actually the strongest, exhibiting similar strengths to garnetite and pyroxenite. And the wettest rocks, the blue schists, are not the weakest. So we actually have this sort of jump across the metamorphic diagram in terms of strongest, weakest, and somewhere in the middle. And interestingly, we see all these different rocks with all these different mechanisms across this zone where deep slow slip and tremor occurs. So there's very different aspects related to the rock strength here and deformation mechanisms, which may feed into creating these slow slip phenomena. So finally, I'll leave you with this sort of big question that I'm thinking about these days is, could low temperature plasticity and strain dependent or scale dependent amphibole strength lead to transients and slow slip events? So in this transitional zone, maybe dislocation avalanches are occurring in response to microscale overstressing, and maybe this could produce something that resembles a slip transient. If it's migrating from grain to grain in a continuous manner, or from pod to pod, from asperity to asperity, linked up because of the rheology of this matrix material, this could potentially be something to think about in terms of creating a mechanical model to think about what is explaining the transient slip that we see in this transitional zone. So with that, I will thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take some questions.